Well, hello everyone. It's Trevor Horwitz here with InfraGuard Atlanta, and I'd like to welcome all of our attendees to another in our series of webinars. Today's webinar is entitled Incident Response, the Anatomy of a Cybersecurity Breach. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and, of course, also welcome our panel. So just to start off and give a quick intro about InfraGuard, we are a partnership between the FBI and the private industry, and our mission is to ensure that we prevent hostile attacks against the United States. If anyone is interested in membership to InfraGuard, they can go to the infraguard.org website and sign up through the national organization, and then you'll be associated with your local chapter. There are 55,000 members of InfraGuard nationwide, and we appreciate everyone's attendance on the webinar this afternoon. I want to start off and introduce our first panelist, Tom. And Tom, why don't you just say hello to our audience and give a quick overview about your background?
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. And thanks for the opportunity today. It's an honor to be here. Very briefly, I joined Zurich Insurance about a year and a half ago. I run their cyber threat intelligence program, but I'm also the deputy of our overall response and intel program globally for Zurich. And prior to that, I did 25 years in the government on Capitol Hill on the House and Senate Intel committees, as well as in the Department of Defense. And unfortunately, I've had way too much experience with breaches, both on the government side and working with some of our business partners and our peer colleagues in the financial services community. And so happy to share my insights today on some of the things I've seen and share some of my war stories.
Thanks, Tom. And again, we appreciate you being on the webinar. Our other panelist today is my friend Dimitri. Dimitri, you want to say hello to our audience?
Hey, Trevor. Thanks so much for inviting me. And it's definitely a pleasure to be here. This is Dimitri Kuczynski. I'm currently with Cisco Security Services Group, and I'm Security Principal and Global Director. In my kind of lifetime, I was in the CISO seat, so directed multiple and built multiple security operations centers, and also handled, a number of breaches for both public and private industries. Had a chance to build risk advisory group that specifically focused on breach response, breach remediation, and for the last several years was heavily focused on risk quantification initiatives that involved working with insurance groups as well as the legal institutions around how to quantify the effect of the, after breach mass in this case, and how to communicate this to your constituents.
Great. Well, thank you, Dimitri. And again, thank you for being on the call. Other panelist today is my friend James Beard. James, why don't you give a quick intro?
And thank you, Trevor, and thanks for allowing me to help out today. My name is James Baird. I'm currently the Vice President of IT Compliance and Security at the American Cancer Society. Although I've spent most of my career in the financial services sector, and unfortunately, like a growing number of people in the financial services industry as well as healthcare, I have firsthand knowledge of going through an actual breach, although not the attack. As it turns out, the attack occurred many, many years prior to my even involvement. So it wasn't until many years after the actual attack that we discovered that we were breached. And that was at a financial services company. I'd be interested to talk about that as well today. So thanks a lot.
Oh, great. So just a quick intro on myself. Again, Trevor Horwitz. I'm the president of InfraGuard Atlanta, and I'm also the CISO for TrustNet. We are a specialist provider of cybersecurity and compliance services headquartered out of Atlanta, Georgia. And I've been involved again with a lot of data breach and incident response throughout my career. And recently I've been involved in a lot of data breach and incident response for the hospitality industry. So without further ado, let's dive into the webinar. Just want to quickly thank our sponsor, which actually happens to be TrustNet, the company I represent, who are sponsoring the webinar today. And there's some info if folks are interested in going out and learning more about TrustNet. And for those out there who are interested in sponsorship, InfraGuard Atlanta is always looking for sponsors for our annual conference, which is coming up early next year, and also for any of these webinars. And feel free to go to the InfraGuard Atlanta.org website for more information. So quick FAQs. The presentation is being recorded, and we will send you a link to the recording after the session. And please feel free to ask us questions. We really love to have this interactive. During the presentation, we'll accumulate all those questions and have a minute at the end just to go through and answer audience questions that they may have. So without further ado, let's talk about our overall process. So what the panelists and I have done is we've identified the different phases of an incident, of a typical incident, and breach response. And what we're going to do is dive into each one of these topics and talk about, lessons learned and how we've been able to glean information and some useful things that you can actually take back and practically introduce into your environment and at least be aware of should an incident occur and you need to respond. So our first topic is talking about identification. And this is a very important step, is identifying whether you've had a breach or not. No one likes false alarms. They're not fun, and you lose a lot of credibility with your executive management team if you either go out and declare an emergency or declare an incident and it turns out to be nothing. So I want to start off with Tom and talk about some of his experience. Tom, how do we address this identification issue? How do we know when we've actually had an incident or where this is sort of a false alarm?
Yeah, I think, Trevor, this is a tough one to talk about in generalities. It's kind of like those I know it when I see it problems, but I think we can provide maybe a couple of insights from our collective experience on this one. I would say from my experience as a DoD intelligence officer and leading into my work in the corporate world, first reports are often wrong, especially when adrenaline's up and people are running about. So I think it's important for the security team to very quickly sort of draw in and take a deep breath and make sure, you collectively understand what's going on before you move up to the next echelon of reporting. But speed is definitely of the essence, particularly, in my experience, I've seen quite a few breaches where it's been identified as data is still going out the door. And that's really a critical time. And you're going to need, depending on how your business is architected, you're going to need buy-in from business unit officers and leaders to start shutting off data flows outbound of the company. So that's a pretty critical juncture where you've got to make that decision about whether you're going to throw that flag or not.
Great. And James, where would you be looking in terms of data sources to identify a leak? I mean, clearly, your SIM is going to get you some information if you have that, but what are the sort of areas where you want to dive into to validate that an incident has occurred?
Well, you've got log files you can review, but to be honest, quite often you'll get the FBI or Secret Service knocking on your front door, and they're monitoring things like paste bin, looking for your data to be exposed on the dark net or on the just remote areas of the internet. So really, having a good SOC in place and having rigid and rigorous log monitoring capabilities is very important. Having the right tools in place to enable you to capture the appropriate logs so that you can detect anomalies in your environment. It's really difficult to do anomaly detection. That's why there's a lot of companies making lots and lots and lots of money who do this for you for most organizations, or a lot of organizations. Not everybody can afford those things. But really, I think managing logs and being able to identify anomalous activity that comes out of logs the experience that I have, we had the Secret Service knock on the front door, which was a completely different experience altogether.
Yeah, I guess one of the last ways you really want to find out about an incident is through a third party. You'd prefer to obviously have that in-house, but often that happens. Someone else notices some payment card information that looks strange, and then they track that down and realize, you're the source of the breach. Dimitri, what's been your experience in terms of identification? Specifically, could you talk about like notification? Like, who do you when you're identifying an incident? What are the first calls you make, and how do you start assembling your team?
Yeah, and just to support what James mentioned, the last thing you want to be is in the seat when you get a fax from the law enforcement notifying you that they found some sort of data on some sort of foreign website or the list of IP addresses that potentially get contacted from your organization. So I completely relate on this. To answer your questions regarding the kind of like sources, especially from a cost perspective, right? My organization releases the reports on an annual basis, and there is a section called cost of inactivity that kind of specifies the overall three causes of the breach, just from the high level perspective. And the top two is the malware and kind of like man-made hacking, low-hanging fruit in this case, as well as the social aspect of the breach itself. From a starting point analysis. And as James mentioned, there is a number of mechanisms in place that an organization needs to have to be able to identify what a breach looks like. Because a breach to one company is not going to be a breach for another company based on the different measures in place, both from Security Operations Center or having the contingent processes within the Security Operations Center based on strategy, all the way down to contact with both insurance as well as legal as well as the law enforcement context, just to verify whether what you've seen is constituted as the malicious activity versus kind of like sheep in the wolf's clothes, meaning like as a false positive you've been notified from managed security service providers. So that's why it's such a hard pinpoint from an identification standpoint to make sure that you see what you're seeing is the malicious activity that you need to react upon.
Okay, great. Moving on to our next question. I know we've got running an audience poll at the moment, and some folks are filling that in. The next area we're going to tackle is containment. So once we've identified that there's an issue, now we have to start the process of obviously limiting the scope and the magnitude of the incident. And there's sort of seems to be two primary areas that we want to focus on. First, you want to protect and keep available critical systems, keep them up and running wherever possible. And the second thing is determine the operational status of the infected systems or the network, whatever the case may be. So what do we need to address here? I'm going to go back to James. How do we address this containment issue? Is this just sort of a mad scramble? How do we get some order to this process?
I was at a meeting with some of my fellow CISOs a few months back, and this particular question came up in conversation. And somebody was, I don't remember who it was, but they were stressing the importance of practice, of exercises where you actually go through the incident response process. And my argument back to them was that exercises don't really, there's no way that you can replicate the hair on fire mentality when you actually have experienced a breach. Maybe it's just my personality, I don't know. But when the excitement raises, whenever the excrement hits the fan, as it were, it tends to become, you tend to throw a lot of things out what you've practiced in the past. Now, having it documented, having your processes documented so you have something to refer to is of ultimate importance. And I think many compliance and regulatory agencies will agree that practicing the ability to respond to an attack is very important, but equally so, and in my book probably more so, is documenting it so that you have that documentation to refer to, because you may not be the primary responder. It may be somebody who hasn't gone through the training or hasn't had the experience that you have. So that's really my 2 cents on that.
Dimitri, what's been your experience here? We're looking at, for example, the operational status of systems. What are the ways we can go about to determine whether they've been infected or not, and how do we address this containment question?
The whole containment issue obviously is interesting because it's totally different based on the vertical or the industry you're in, right? Well, when you think about this, what's the cost of doing business? And ultimately the cost of doing business at some point of time is going to supersede the initial value of the breach, right, or the value of inactivity to the breach. So you have to be able to kind of quantify the ability to say, well, we can function for now based on that level of inactivity without the level of containment, and then ultimately determine all the vectors of attacks in this case. So there's both technical and business heavy analysis that you need to be able to provide to both to the board and the CIO when you're actually reporting to those levels of breaches. I mean, to tell you one of the experiences, I've been personally involved in running the war room for during several large breaches. There were two, one obviously internal IT organization who's been obviously the subject matter expert. They know their environment much better than everybody else. Two external consultancy IR groups. Third IR group was sponsored by external legal counsel. And then there was a fourth IR group, external IR group basically, sponsored by the company, but had a dotted line reporting to the PCI Council, since they were a PFI accredited organization. So imagine the multitude of containment advice that you get from four different level organizations that the CIO has to take into consideration. That's why you have to be very, very specific in terms of when you say, oh, well, drop the hammer, put some sort of containment in place, whether it's on the endpoint or the infrastructure, right? Versus let the activity continue for the business to continue to run. So it's a very touchy-feeling question. You're absolutely right.
And Tom, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I would love to stress that point about exercising before you actually go into battle. It's every time I've been through one of these exercises, either in the government or in the private sector, we always learn things, and people always walk away with homework. Especially when you're bringing folks to the table, like your legal shop or your public affairs shop. They don't do this every day, and so they haven't thought through the implications of what this might mean. And so getting them to think through what they're going to do and sort of get their house in order so that they're not wasting time in the heat of an incident, so they're ready to go.
It seems like a lot of the focus when it comes to containment is, preventing collateral damage. And that may mean, revoking user accounts or blocking access at firewalls, even updating antivirus rules to block, offensive malware. One of the things that I've seen is most folks will go through a sort of a checklist approach of here's the three operational status issues we can look at. We can disconnect the system from a network and allow it to continue on a standalone basis, or we can just shut down that system completely and bring it to its knees, or allow the system to keep on running on the network and really just be in a monitoring phase. And I guess depending on the anecdotal evidence, those are sort of the three decision points that folks will need to go through. So moving on to our next page.
I just want to add something, right? From the issue of containment, this is a dual-edged sword, right? On the one side, you need to stop the bleeding, stop the activity. On the other side, you need to preserve the evidence, right? So the two of those activities almost fighting against each other on a regular basis, especially when you have customer records and the payment records involved. That's, the preservation almost like as important as the containment in place. So think about this, pulling something off your network that's ultimately going to rewrite the logs over and over again, or putting some sort of hammer in place without studying the further activity of the bad actor. So that's the critical point where you have to address up front through multiple training exercises that you have to have internally through your supply chain and especially through your suppliers and partners and obviously law enforcement.
No, good points. All right, moving on to the next phase, which is investigation. So in this phase, really what we're trying to do is determine what actually happened to the system or the computer or the network, whatever's been impacted, and then start doing a little bit of a deeper dive. What data was accessed? When was it accessed? What was the time frame? Can we identify the bad actors? And typically we're not going to see a name in a log file, but you're going to get a source IP address and start to do some tracing. And probably the most important question in this next phase is the investigation phase is how. How did the hackers get in? And how did this breach occur? And one of the things that I really like to do when we've done this exercise in live exercises is answer the question why. Because often if you can answer the question why, it can lead you to other areas of the business that potentially have been impacted. So, Dimitri, what do you think should be the sort of first steps that folks should go through in determining what happened?
I think there's a number of books, obviously, based on the first responder kind of playbook, first responder designation, number of trainings involved with this that kind of talk about the basic activity, right, that you need to understand from endpoint, containment, patient zero, all the way down, kind of moving from the understanding how the threat actors were moving, along the line, whether it's through the log, investigating the predetermined number of logs, or looking through the payloads, whether it's a NetFlow event, whether it's ability to look through your SIM systems and look at the multiple sources of information together in this case. That kind of predetermines your investigation patterns. At the same time, what I've seen a lot of the usability from both external and external threat intelligence groups that also could be either part or separately from your security operations centers that add value to that level of investigation, and then continually feed those threat indicators to you on a regular basis, associated either with the threat actor, with this particular attack, or with a similar level of patterns they've seen historically this organization been involved, right? And obviously recording this on a regular basis. That means that some other organization will be double checking those efforts and making sure they didn't miss anything, from the beginning.
Well, great. James, you mentioned something earlier about having law enforcement, knock on your door. Well, when you're going through the investigation phase, how do you go about maintaining that sort of evidence that you can use either for law enforcement or, further on down the line? Where do you retain their documentation? What format is it? And how do you get engineers that are in the containment phase or just post-containment, how do you get them to maintain a proper audit trail?
Yeah, well, those are great questions. Obviously, we have to have some ability to have a separate system, another system of record that's used exclusively for law enforcement, that you have the ability to both encrypt and provide the necessary controls around protecting the integrity of the information that goes on those systems. So the experience that I have, we had access to files, log files that went back as far as 5 years, and then it was at the end of those 5 years there were telltale signs in the system that pointed to an application vulnerability that was called, I'm sure I've heard of the SQL Server attack. So we were able to determine from that, and we had several groups doing forensics for us. We had a national group doing it, and we also had PFEs come in and do it, as well as having the Secret Service was on site performing their work as well. And so each of them made separate requests for the data to be archived and reserved for them. So the experience that I had, and this was for a very large financial services company, and we had to maintain several different sequentially similar systems that had the data that everybody was asking for. So log files and checksums all over the place, and all sorts of information that we had to gather in various formats for these different law enforcement and industry teams as well. So yeah, it's a big challenge, and it's very expensive to go through.
And Tom, what's your take as far as this next phase, this investigation?
I think those questions you posed in there, Trevor, of the who and the why are really important ones. Particularly when you've got a regulator or a board or the press or a regulator breathing down your neck, and those questions can be often very frustratingly difficult to answer. One vignette I can offer from a company that I know, they received a visit from the FBI, and they got what we call a tear line, where the evidence the FBI had was classified, and they can only give you a few fragments of what they know based on the sensitivity of the sources. And so they told this company, hey, you have 3 executives who received spear phishing emails from a very advanced threat actor, and here's the email addresses, have fun. And they weren't able to provide any support beyond that. And so they had a really difficult time, especially since some time had passed, figuring out, sort of, had they clicked on it, was there a payload downloaded, and those things of that nature. One pattern I've seen quite a bit in the past with a couple of major breaches, the company finds evidence of an advanced threat actor getting in, but they don't seem to have taken anything out. And so then you're left with a question, were they just using me to get to somebody else, basically hijacking my infrastructure to attack somebody else? Or did they get something out and I just missed the exfil because these guys were so good? And, the problem you may be faced with is you may never be able to answer those questions if the attacker cleaned up after themselves, or if there was some gap in your log monitoring for that piece of your infrastructure.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, because a lot of these questions you said, you may never have an answer to. A lot of it may come out to guesswork, even after the fact. Even after a lot of time has evolved, you may never really understand why the hackers got in, or even necessarily what exact vector they used, which is kind of scary.
And I think one thing that may be helpful, before you get to this incident, is to do an inventory of your critical assets and figure out what might a bad actor be interested in. And so when you see them touching a piece of an infrastructure, you have that list at hand, and you can know, okay, this is what he could have gotten. Because that's difficult to do, particularly if you're dealing with a breach in the course of a weekend or something like that, when the regular 9-to-5 crew are difficult to get a hold of.
Yeah, that's a good point. Up until a couple of years back, no one was really thinking about emails as being something that needed to be protected. There was a large email marketing company that got hacked, and a lot of their customers were financial institutions. So people realized that the reason that they were targeted was because it gave the hackers email addresses of these financial institutions and their customers, and that provided a great opportunity for a spear phishing attack, because now they had context, not just an email address, but that context about where they could be creating fake emails as if they were coming from that financial institution and using that for fraud later on down the line. So that's obviously a big issue. Our next topic, and I want to ask Dimitri to step into this, is the eradication phase. So, here our objective is to, sanitize all our systems and get rid of malicious code and unauthorized accounts, etc. What are your sort of pointers, Dimitri, on eradication? What should folks be doing in the environment?
I mean, you have right now listed, obviously, the steps that most of the people think about this, from sanitizing all the systems, but also determining what changes need to happen both on a short-term and a long-term basis, right? And eradication, on top of all those technical places, is also a place to think about your longer-term changes in terms of longer-term investment. That's where you have to feed the C-level executives as well as the board. What are the contributing factors, right, that specifically approach that public or non-public breach in this case? Because when you look at just a simple change, unauthorized accounts for an organization, whether it's financial or retail institutions, that have been running the same infrastructure for the past 20, 25 years, look at every single account, assuming they have over 300 to 400 different partners within the supply chain, it's an enormous task, right? So it might be a simple task to look at unauthorized accounts, but it might generate multiple work streams that somebody needs to be responsible for. Then another type is knowing that you looked at all the activities of the threat actors, whether it's associated with your subsidiaries, your internal, or the supply chain ultimately, right? So you need to appoint people responsible for running the actual eradication steps and almost running it as a project you would run through your regular PMO organizations. So almost like treating it from your day-to-day activities from a start all the way down to the end, in this case with the executive level reporting.
Great. And Tom, what's your take on eradication? What sort of cleanup steps would you recommend? How do we go about this task?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that's been said so far. I think one thing to think ahead of when it comes to eradication is, do you have the skills and the resources within your own organization to do that, or do you need to have a pre-existing relationship with a vendor that can come in and help you, who's got experience with eradicating, particularly if you're dealing with an advanced threat actor, either a nation state or a criminal group, that, like Dirty Harry said, a man's got to know his limitations. You may want to have a tool or a vendor you can reach for that can really help you make sure that you've really cleaned everything out, because it's a very painful process, rebuilding, re-imaging devices and servers, and the business is not going to enjoy 1 minute of that, given the disruption that can take. So it's a pretty involved process, particularly if the attacker moved laterally across big pieces of your network.
And that actually brings a good point. Who has to worry about stayed green, meaning running the infrastructure, versus working on the eradication? That it's the ultimate question that you need to ask. If you throw your entire IT and security staff on eradication, who's going to left with running the company or the rest of the company IT infrastructure?
And I've seen recently as well, a lot of cybercrime insurance providers are making this a requirement to that companies obtain some kind of a retainer on a firm to help them make it through an incident as well. And you're missing one on the screen. I know there's a lot we're missing, but one of the more important things for a bullet on that screen is to change every password that you own.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that from my experience has been when you're going into this eradication phase is this cleanup exercise, and often that means running antivirus scans across infected devices, and even coming down to if it's malware that's embedded or you've got a rootkit, rebuilding the OS, or sometimes even replacing the entire hard drive and reconstructing systems. One of the challenges is that you have all the tools at your disposal to do that very quickly. So having good backups is sort of a critical area to go and rebuild servers and with the right configuration. It's not going to take you an inordinate amount of time. I think one of the saviors has been sort of the virtualization model that's helped us to deploy and recreate those systems with a click of a button. Made it a lot easier for folks to sort of respond to these attacks. Any other comments before we move into the next topic? Okay, so our next phase is talking about sort of the recovery stage, and here our objective is to ensure that our systems meet company standards and baselines before they actually get returned to service. So let's again start with Tom. What's your take here? What do we need to look for in terms of the recovery phase? What makes sense here?
Yeah, again, this is a tough one to answer in generalities, at least for me, because I've seen so many different phases. And one of the biggest challenges I've seen in past breaches is beyond having trouble answering that who and why question is, are you really sure that you've gotten every bit of the infection before you basically declare the incident over and go back to business as usual? I would say that another big problem that runs alongside all this is sort of decision points you have to reach about notifications, either public notifications or notifications to your regulators, and that's going to be different for every company and sector. I think those are probably some of the biggest questions we struggle with in past recovery operations.
And James, any pointers on recovery?
I mean, you obviously have to have a good backup. If you don't have a good way to deploy systems to begin with, you're going to have an awfully difficult time doing recovery, getting your systems back up and running again. So one of the critical processes to have inside of an organization is the ability to build systems to spec and to standardize and to put baselines into place. And if you don't have that, then your ability to recover is severely hampered, even if you're using an outside party.
Yeah, and where does an outside party fit into this in terms of recovery? Dimitri, what's your take?
Yeah, I was just thinking about this when Tom was saying regarding the whole ability to approach recovery as a phase, because to executive management it might seem recovery it's almost you going down the slope of the activity of the incident, but to a lot of the organizations it's still you are the peak of the incident itself, or the incident response activities. And to me, recovery has to be done hand in hand with a third party, especially around the process called security monitoring. So a lot of security operations centers have security monitoring involved, either through third parties or some involvement through the analyst. Right? And this information needs to be continuously shared across the board, which means you have to have a model and a playbook in place to be able to share that level of activity and security monitoring for the systems that you recover one by one in this case. So you record this one system, the process, you have to reestablish this process or re-verify the process with a third party, whether it's managed security provider, whether it's supply chain in this case, who are also monitoring this for you, to understand is there a chance for the system to get reinfected, and assume if it gets reinfected, how do you get notified? Especially when it's when it's associated with the, very sensitive customer data, whether it's patient data, financial data, or the customer activities in this case.
Yeah, all great points. We've been running a poll now and having a little bit of technical issues with the poll, but the question we posed was, how frequently do you assess the readiness of the incident response team? So what do you guys think? Is this something that should be done on an ongoing basis, almost like continuous, or is this an annual thing, or how do we address that?
I can give it a shot. From a starting point, Trevor, in this case, despite what a lot of security officers like in terms of continuously testing their security operations, the reality is you're fighting for the resources and for their time compared to running business as a regular process, right? On top of the regular DR testing, legal and risk testing that you're constantly responding to audits, you almost have very little time to have this little testing. And I've seen organizations testing this, number one, on an annual basis because it's part of the incident response plan, or on, almost on a quarterly basis, from starting with the light tabletop all the way down to the full-scale attack simulation, whether it's against the DDoS attack, whether it's against the wide-scale malware attack against the entire company, which caused the follow-up plans to either rebuild crisis management organization or rebuild the entire incident response planning. And that's kind of like in between that timeline, at least from my experience.
Yeah, sorry, Trevor, I was talking on mute there, but that's a fantastic answer, yeah.
Yeah. James, you got a take on this as well?
As far as, I'm sorry, so what was the question again? I apologize.
Well, we're talking about how frequently do you assess the readiness of your incident response team?
Right.
What is that something that should be done on an ongoing basis, or real-time continuous, or is this something that you just schedule once a year and do a bench test?
I was going to make the comment earlier. I believe Dimitri had mentioned that the incident response plan for most organizations has us testing it on an annual basis. And one of the funny things that I always find is if you're in a regulated organization, your incident response plan reflects whatever the regulators tell you to do. So really the organization themselves could be less interested in doing this test at whatever frequency they're doing it only for compliance sake. And that's unfortunately the case for a lot of organizations is that these types of tests and these types of exercises are mandated and not voluntary. Now, if you were looking at it in terms of what's the best practice, and what most people who've gone through this exercise, like I think those of us who are on the panel today, we would all recommend that you do it more often. And I agree with Dimitri. We have a lot of resource constraints. Kit-low is very important, keeping the lights on in an organization. There's a lot of different tasks that people have to go through on a daily basis, and we can't really afford to take them away to focus on these types of things. But if you get the buy-in from the folks above you, from the CIO to the CEO, and specifically the board of directors, and they say, yeah, this is important enough for us to focus on. And I believe a lot of board of directors, especially these days, they're hearing a lot from the news about breaches, and they want to make sure that the amount of downtime is reduced to the minimum possible. And if we can prevent it from occurring, which is very, very unlikely, but if you can prevent it from occurring, even the better. But I think they all understand incident response is important. So I think you're going to be able to see. I think that we will see, if it hasn't already come to pass in everybody's business that has regulations specifically, but anybody who's storing sensitive information, you'll see a greater ability to perform that type of testing, just so we can make sure that we have some experience on the ground.
And Trevor, I would add that it's really important to do sort of unannounced tests of your response team with a third party, basically to make sure that you really know what they can do, because you'll never really get that until they get tested and they think it's for real.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's sort of the same approach as doing a sort of a black hat or double blind penetration test, where the the folks in the network security team don't know that it's coming, and all of a sudden they're under attack, and see how they respond.
And you can blend that with a phishing simulation of your employees as well to see how well they're doing in terms of their security awareness.
All right. Yeah, we put up a couple of polls, and I apologize. We had some technical issues on getting some feedback on the polls, but we did get some good data out of that. One of the last ones we put up there was looking at the percentage of the security budget that was spent on incident response readiness. And we put out some, categories there from 20% down to like less than 5%. And clearly the majority of folks who responded to that were in the less than 5%. This question goes back to, let's say, James. Do you feel like the industry is providing enough resources and incident response readiness, or is this an area where we really need to improve?
For companies or for third parties who are providing this service?
No, I'd say like for companies. Are businesses allocating enough resources for incident response readiness, or is this just something that they're not paying attention to?
As I said before, I think that a lot of companies are turning a corner on this, and it's the boards of directors and the folks who are reading the Wall Street Journal or on Delta and getting Sky Miles magazine, and they're looking at these articles that come out. And I believe that the number of breaches that have been publicly reported, and the size of the breaches, and the number of people who've gone to jail or have lost so much money trying to fight back on the breaches, I think that has all convinced a lot of boards of directors and a lot of people at the executive level in companies that it's very important to spend time on this. So I believe that whether it's happened at your company today, it will. I believe that the pure publicity of these things and the size of these attacks that have happened even recently, that a lot of folks are going to start turning up the spigot on making available resources for us to do the amount of testing required so that it doesn't happen or that we can recover quickly.
Yeah, all good points. Moving on to our next topic, and it'll be the last formal topic, and then we'll get into some Q&A. I'm going to pose this question to Dimitri, but looking at lessons learned, here obviously our goal is to detail and provide a report on exactly what happened on the incident. What's your take on lessons learned, and how can we go about this exercise to make it most productive?
Trevor, I think that kind of area also connects to your previous question, right? Is that security testing increasing from a legislator standpoint? I want to tackle this first, if you don't mind. So what we're seeing from industry side, that the overall security budgets being somewhere between 2 to 4%, kind of growing to about 6% of the overall IT budget, right? And that growth been specifically attributed to the publicity of the breaches, number one, but also the fact that the board is getting more and more awareness. The board of directors of every company get more awareness about those security breaches because the board members share the common responsibility, and when they pick up a Wall Street Journal or some other business or public news side or something, they actually see that some other organization, whether it's financial or the healthcare, been breached, and they ask their CISO, what are we doing about this, right? So every kind of lesson learned, every breach, that has an ability to lead back to the board and communicate to the board what exactly led to the breach and what needs to happen for us to avoid that breach, right? There is a saying, don't let a good breach go to waste, right? There's specifically a reason for that in terms of not just who, what, and why happened from a breach perspective, but also what are we doing next specifically? Are we investing into the infrastructure, into the people and the process aspect? Do we need to have investment to the security operations center, or reevaluate our entire third-party risk? I just recently joined an organization called FAIR Institute as a board member. It's a public organization, specifically focuses on how do we communicate risk in more of a, tangible terms in dollars and cents specifically, which leads to the incident response testing completely. And what I'm seeing more and more security executives, trying to go from this yellow, green, blue, red, whatever the color coding, into more of a dollars and cents reporting to the board of directors, right? Their metrics now include their financial reporting, not just the effectiveness of their investment, but effectiveness of their investment against a particular threat, which kind of leads to the lesson learned from a breach itself. Whether it's a breach related to your organization or related to the organization next door or to within the industry itself, there's always this ability to take the lesson learned and apply it to you and then communicate it to the board on a regular basis.
Okay, great. So we're on to the last couple minutes left for our presentation, so I want to get into some Q&A. So this question comes from Mark in North Carolina, and I'm going to ask Tom to address this. And I think you actually touched on this earlier. How does a automated or an effective asset management system help in an incident response?
Oh, I would say that a good understanding of your assets is critical for every step of your security process, way before you even get to a breach, but particularly critical in the case of a breach. When you see evidence of a malicious actor entering a part of your environment, you're in a really bad place if he understands your environment better than you do. I've always said that by measuring something, you improve it. Just by laying out your asset database, I think you'll often see where some problems or some discontinuities exist. But I would say, to answer his question in short, it's critical.
I had another question from Scott in Florida, and Scott wants to know, have we in our experience seen an increase of business email compromises? So I think maybe what Scott's referring to is spear phishing attacks. Dimitri, have you seen that as being something you've seen in your experience on the rise?
Oh, definitely. Especially, we several of our peer groups handled multiple breaches in the past 6 to 9 months. A lot of the breaches associated with the healthcare institutions, and a lot of healthcare is leveraging email at the business level communication with the patients, with the payers, and that becomes number one target for attackers. That kind of leads to the compromise of the internal information overall. We're also seeing that a lot of organizations trying to invest into public infrastructure, specifically associated with the email protection, since they're seeing, username and password is just not enough to protect this. Financial industries got to this point a long time ago, right? Healthcare is catching up. Some of the retail institutions are also catching up from a protection mechanism. But that is, one of the top probably 5 sources of attack that we're actually seeing is, targeting the email systems.
Okay, next question comes from Ed in Georgia, and I'm going to ask Tom to address this. The question is, the attendee is interested in how businesses quantify the cost of security incidents. So how do we go about that process?
Yeah, I think I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, but this comes back to the issue of understanding your critical assets and your sensitive data. And I see these numbers fly around, like $1 billion, $1 trillion a year in breaches globally, and there are some things you'll never be able to quantify. Say if you're a large manufacturing company and someone gets the engineering designs for your next product and beats you to market, you'll never be able to reliably quantify what you might have made in that. You can cordon off some very measurable parts like your legal costs, your breach notification, your credit monitoring for affected customers. But if a couple of your customers walked away because they lost confidence in you after a breach went public, that's going to be something that's going to be really hard to quantify what you might have lost in future business.
I think that from my experience, again, I'm at American Cancer Society. If we were to suffer a breach, we are a tier 1 PCI merchant. And if I were to suffer a breach, I would lose the ability, or many of the people who give us money today, who donate money to the society, will find another charity. So for us, reputation risk is the most critical part about handling a breach, or about the fear of being breached.
Yeah, he brings up a good point. I mean, you can quantify, lost revenue or lost donations in a not-for-profits environment, It's very hard to quantify, maybe impossible to quantify, loss of goodwill. How do you quantify that? And you see that with other hacks that have taken place, data breaches, Home Depot, Target, all these companies that have had these huge public breaches. It's hard to quantify. Some of them, the sad experience for a lot of companies is because there are so many hacks taking place, it has had little impact on their reputation because it's almost expected today that it's going to happen. It's kind of sad for our industry. I had another great question here from John, and this will be the last question for the webinar. And John's question is on how communication flow works in an incident. And has this failed or succeeded, both to internal and external parties? And we didn't really address communication flow, but I think that's sort of a theme. It goes from the time an incident is identified all the way through lessons learned is this communication channel. And it poses back to Tom. What's your take as far as communication? Are we doing a good job in that respect from what you've seen in the industry, or are there a lot of things lacking?
Yeah, I think if you've never been through a breach before, you're going to learn a lot about how to communicate and who you need to be talking to, and that's why exercises are so important on the front end, so that that you've got that sort of that diagram mapped out of who needs to be informed of what and when, and you've got to give careful thought to sort of who on your response team or is it your intel guy who's going to be communicating up the chain of command about what's going on, so that your response team's not being bombed by requests and updates, by curious or panicked parties throughout the company, and they all have a single point of contact, almost a press spokesman, to talk to the rest of the company about what's going on and keep them updated without distracting your team from the work they need to do. This, on a related point, I can't stress enough that every organization should have an out-of-band comms plan when there's an incident, because if you have an advanced malicious actor on your network, you don't want him reading your emails about how you're responding to his activities and being able to get inside your decision loop. And so, whether it's text messages or private Gmail accounts, all your key response staff should know how to get a hold of each other outside of the enterprise network in the time of crisis.
Oh, great. All great responses. Well, we're at I'm here with our schedule for the webinar, and so I want to wrap it up. Firstly, again, thanks so much to our three panelists. If anyone in the audience could just stand up and give a standing ovation to them, that would be appreciated. Thanks, guys. We appreciate your participation, and to our audience, we appreciate you guys attending and participating in it. Great questions. I think we're going to actually go ahead and put these questions up on the InfoGuard Atlanta website as well, and on our blog. So look out for that. And a recording will be coming around to you as soon as it's processed. And again, appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you, Trevor.
Thanks, Trevor.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Trevor.
Okay, guys. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch. Bye-bye.